When my mother was 15, her father, my grandfather, died of a heart attack. Her mother, my grandmother, Granny Maisel, was in her mid-30s. My mother was the youngest of 3 children, the only one still in high school. The other 2, my uncle was in the Army, my aunt had gone off to work in the Rosie the Riveter times, and my grandmother joined the WACs. She said to me later, this was the time I knew I was a survivor. This was the time, you know, I'd always grown my own food and fed the family, and my grandmother, you know, could make soap and butcher animals and do everything it took to live off the land. She was a scrappy West Virginia granny, but she had never earned money. And so when she joined the WACs, she went overseas. She'd never been out of West Virginia. And she started to send money to my mother, who was living then with her friends and also with her aunt and uncle. My grandmother always told this story as a story of rebirth, as her re-envisioning herself as a woman who would need to support herself. She'd always pictured herself as a farm wife, as somebody who, as I said, could work the land and get what the family needed to eat, but not be out in the world providing. And so for her, this was an amazingly powerful part of her life to remember. She loved to talk about it. My mother talked about that time of life as well. She described the time when her father died and suddenly her mother also abandoned her, leaving West Virginia, the only place she'd ever been, and going to the war where my mother feared she would also die. My mother had incredible grief and bitterness about exactly this same period of time that my grandmother experienced as rebirth and life generating. I used to listen to these 2 stories, and it took me a while. It took me till I was in college to have the nerve to say to them, you know, you really should talk to each other about this, because you both talk about this time a lot, but you tell completely different stories. It strikes me as we think about stories of rebirth that they're all complicated. One person says with pride that they left a marriage that was killing them, that wasn't working, while the grieving partner behind them says, what do you mean it wasn't working? It was working fine. I'm dying here. And whether or not that grieving partner picks up and also finds life from the situation depends on how we all make sense of things that happen. My grandmother would never have chosen to join the WACs. That wasn't a world she ever would have envisioned for herself. And yet that act redefined her sense of who she was and how she lived the rest of her life. After that, she knew she could do anything. And after my mother was left, she also knew, in a way that was both painful but also positive, that she at 15 was kind of on her own. She wasn't an adult, but she wasn't a child anymore either. She was going to need to take care of herself. Eleanor Roosevelt, who seems to have said a lot of really amazing things, if you look at all the quotes that are attributed to her, I think she really said them. Anyway, she said people are like tea bags. You can't tell how strong they are until they've really been immersed in hot water. And rebirth, whether by fire or by hot water, often involves a total reimagination of what we might be capable of doing. I think about this when I read stories of people who left their homeland because of war, because of economic necessity. Both the people who have amazing journeys walking through the desert without water and the people who get on a plane and leave, in either way, being in a new country means that you learn often a new language and certainly a new culture. I know that many of you who attend these services come from around the world and that many of you are expats. You're not living where you grew up. And I'm sure you have stories to tell about the kind of rebirth that comes from being in a different place. In some fundamental way, rebirth is always about being in a different place, whether it's being in a 12-step meeting instead of at the bar, whether it's walking down the street holding hands with someone of the same gender rather than behind the picket fence as Ozzie and Harriet that you always pictured you'd live in. Whatever it is, however the rebirth happens, it's sort of like birth. There's one environment when the baby's in the womb, and then there's a completely different environment to adjust to, suddenly breathing air, being out of that comfort sack. And the amazing thing to me is how many times we can be reborn in different ways. One thing that I love about Unitarian Universalism is that you don't have to leave when some part of your identity shifts. You know, you can be a pagan who suddenly is spoken to. And I know someone this happened to, a devout pagan who suddenly Jesus is visiting at night, and suddenly she's embracing Christianity. But what a gift that she can stay in the same community and not have to drop everything and leave. In order to be reborn, we need supportive communities. My grandmother walked into the whole military community to hold her and shape her and let her know who she might become. My mother stayed with her aunt and her uncle and her friends and that community back in South Charleston, West Virginia, reminding her of who she still was, even as she processed who she was becoming without her parents there to provide steady guidance. Rebirth is both an internal experience and it's one that comes to us, that's reflected back to us. William James, who was a famous, he kind of invented really the psychology of religion. He talked about twice-born souls and once-born souls. And he said that a lot of people are perfectly happy being once-born souls. That is to say, those people come into the world, they're given a worldview, that worldview works for them, they never fight against it, they never walk away from it, and they live and die, and that's it. Twice-born souls, on the other hand, are the people for whom something stops working. Either someone dies, or some belief system seems like a lie, or in some way, they just can't live within the confines of what's presented to them and leave it alone. I think our community is mostly twice-born souls. That is to say, we're the questioners, we're the pushers of the edge, we're the people who have to. It's just in our nature that we can't leave it alone. And I, for one, find that a beautiful way to be. There are some faith communities that really value conformity and adherence and obedience. And I would say from the very beginning, our own faith tradition has been more about the heretics and the rebels and the ones who can't leave it alone. Sometimes I have to admit I really envy those once-born souls. And as I watch my teenager grow up and hear, oh, why is it so easy for some people? They're not questioning everything. I remember how that used to be for me as when I was younger. I think as we get older, we find communities to hold us in our complexity, and that helps us to get to be as complicated as we are. If you're a once-born soul, honest to God, my hat is off to you, but I kind of doubt that you're here. I kind of think that this community tends to be people for whom rebirth is a way of life, for whom questioning and taking away the debris and reforming and reshaping is ongoing. It's not something that happens once and then we say, I've been reborn. Rather, it's a daily practice, sometimes dramatic, sometimes very unglamorous. It's just what we're doing. It's just how we live. Being reborn, creating new homes and new environments can look a variety of ways. Sometimes the most personal, deeply transformational ones are like a spider building a web where the material for the new environment comes from within us. Other times we're more like a bird rounding up materials, finding the right twigs to hold us, to create a space for us. Sometimes we're diving into mud or a cave, going deep down into the earth to find that place where we're held. Sometimes rebirth is more realizing that a seed we didn't even know someone had scattered is growing next to us, and without even knowing it, we realize we're being shaded and shaped by this plant that somebody just randomly, apparently, planted. There are so many ways and so many shapes for this kind of rebirth to happen, and this month we'll be exploring a lot of them. But your own story is also important. I hope that as you go through this month, you will feel called to name and honor those rebirths that you have experienced. And I hope that this community will be part of that naming. I hope that your own rebirth experience is filled with joy and intention and commitment. I hope that you know the pleasure of shaping and aiming and attaining. Whether your own rebirth comes from situation you would never have chosen or whether it comes from choice, may it be a time for you of deepening, of getting wiser, and of reaching out so that each day you touch more of us.